Hi, Jamie. How are you?
Oh, good morning, and it's great to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you too. I missed you last week whilst I was away doing family things, but it's really good to be back. And what a week of writing, of new information. Um, just phenomenal.
Well, thank you. And I think, given the current kind of chronological things that we're experiencing here, where you have holidays in Britain and we don't, and I have time zone that's not synchronizing with your time zone currently, I think that we should all come to the agreement around the world that the new Greenwich mean is right here at my house, and that all holidays will be shared amongst us. And that way it's very easy logistically.
Then we'll be fine.
Yes,
So,
I should present that to the UN.
so I'm sure Mr. Trump would love it.
Jamie Meantime. That's what we'll call it. Jamie Meantime. So,
Yeah. So thinking about this week, let's dive straight into the DSM and GLPs. You've written a lot about that this week and the architecture of language, how it lands. And really, whilst many autistic advocates, people, neurodiversity affirming professionals, parents, perhaps don't like the style of the DSM, there's something else that we perhaps need to think about in terms of actually what it is looking at.
well, I did a standalone piece a while ago
Mhm.
trying to explain, like somebody comes on Substack and they ask me a question. And it's a valid question. I want to answer it. And this one was, you describe in your book how your original diagnosis was Asperger's disorder, and then these separate sensory processing and integration problems and disorders and whatnot. And then in DSM-5, right, that was DSM-4. In DSM-5, all of a sudden you're ASD on support level 2 for language. And that makes no sense because in Asperger's, in the diagnostic criteria, the difference between Asperger's and ASD then in DSM-4 was language, right? You had to have had expressive language to not get the ASD, the autism part. And
Mm.
so the fact that you had enough expressive language landed you in the Asperger's side. And so I had to explain that, how it makes perfect sense if you're a gestalt processor, right? And by the time I encountered psychiatry in that way, both inpatient and outpatient, I had enough scrapes to mitigate responses. And therefore, I was deemed articulate. I was an adult, right? And I was not, a wee child that was frightened or whatever. I mean, I was frightened, absolutely, but
Mhm.
I could put an answer together. And so all of the other things that make me autistic landed me in the Asperger's side. And then the transfer from 4 to 5, I did not have a choice. I did not have a real reevaluation. It was just the system, the medical system in which I'm a part said, well, given all of these things, this is where you fit now. Um, and I still have great difficulty with language. I know outwardly it doesn't seem like that. Productively, two Substacks and stuff, it does not seem like that. But that's, for me, that's occupational therapy,
Mhm.
and to a certain extent, I absolutely love meeting with you every weekend and chatting to you and all these things. But this is also occupational therapy in that sense. So I wanted to explain that, and I wanted to be very gentle about answering that question, not just, you know, a typical two-line reply in a Substack note or something. So I wrote that. And then from that standpoint, it was kind of like, well, wait a minute, Jamie, you need to do a bit more explanation of that. And of course, me being me, it morphed to a very, very kind of long and winding and recursive look at the
Yeah.
DSM itself. And I'm recalling naysayers and where's your evidence and all of these kinds of things. And I'm re-examining DSM from the standpoint that why created as it was created, right? If we can
Mhm.
just go back to the original premise of the design, it was meant to give psychiatry a reliable and a repeatable framework that independent clinicians can look at and observe behaviors and
Mhm.
say, oh, this is that thing, right? And they would
Yeah.
all come to generally the same conclusion. And if you look across the entirety of English speaking autistic people, we all tend to have these same kinds of behaviors, right? And now in DSM-5 on the text revision, they say like the level of support you require gives you that, support needs and stuff. So I took the thought of that and said, well, essentially what these psychiatrists, independent around the English-speaking world, have done is created field notes for us. They've created data.
Mm.
And given that the DSM and its description of autism is almost entirely surface behaviors, right? The outward expression of things. Um, they've created all of this output data, all these field notes,
Mm.
but the things that they are observing are actually the outward representation of cognitive processes that they don't examine, they don't
Yeah.
question where this repetitive speech and behavior comes from. They don't interrogate where this pragmatic problem comes from in conversations and social stuff. And so I saw, I said, I wonder what that would look like if I did it. And so I did. And here we are.
So let's talk in more detail then. So let's think about what the DSM says and your take on it in terms of, I mean, I guess one of the things is it talks about echolalia, echolalic speech, repetitive speech. And we know that that is the early stages. It's the first inkling that we might have that a child, for example, is a gestalt language processor. But I guess the difference is we don't necessarily, what you're writing from is that actually they're not interested in why and how it got there. It's just purely as an identification means, but actually it's a very clear one. So it's where does gestalt language processing and where does autism start finish?
Right. And that is the whole of it. Right. That's what I've been doing. Right. And if you look at the criteria in ASD, right,
Mhm.
in the DSM, they call it repetitious behavior, repetition, right? And where parents see that, right, they ask a question and they get the line from a cartoon or a movie or a book or something that somebody read to the child, and they think, well, that's slightly out of place. That's communicating something, obviously, but it's not. This repetition is not contextually accurate, right? And I know in my own life, borrowing from the brand new genre of music video and stuff like that I was absolutely fascinated by in the 80s. Somebody would ask me a question, I wouldn't have the right script, and so I would just default to, I didn't do it. Well, and then the response, from the adult, I didn't ask you if you did it. I asked you blah, blah, blah. Right. And
Mm.
I didn't do it, and that's the one I had.
Yeah.
Right. And I know, I put it in the paper about where that's sourced from, a cheeky video from Madness. Um, but that's kind of where parents start noticing it, is that the context is skewed. It's not right. And we Jamie keeps saying this thing over and over again, and they never interrogate like where that comes from or why it's generated or
Mm.
anything. They're just like, no, just answer me.
Yeah.
I know you didn't do it. Answer me. And so that's the repetition side of the criteria. And that ties into the phrasing itself, right? Where you have, this kind of age inappropriate prosody that Gestalt processors sometimes have, especially the hyperlexic, where that's where I was talking earlier about
Mm.
the BBC presenter, right? Um, and some parents are creeped out about that. Like, why all of a sudden you sound like Jeremy Clarkson. I don't know why that is, where did this come from? And so, these expressions, they end up in conversation, and people who are kind of attuned to you and they're listening, they're like, wait a minute, that phrasing does not sound you. It sounds borrowed. But again,
Yeah.
they do not interrogate where that comes from, the cognition that produces it, and the need for that, which ties in again to the pacing of conversation. And I know because I'm very kind of shy and hyper aware of myself in public, which is why I've never done it until very, very recently. And indeed, thanks to you. Um, but my pacing is all over the place, right? It bursts and it slows down, and I mean, it's uniquely me. Things flood
Mhm.
into my verbal processing, and then I have to catch up a bit. But I have to get it out first. And all of these kinds of,
Yeah.
very autistic things are also very gestalt things. And then our problems with figurative language, the pragmatics that the DSM describes. I see this because I've lived cross-culturally where, there are things, idioms and so on that I've never been exposed to. And so, I don't have a bridge linguistically to say what that means, right? I
Hmm.
haven't had enough repeated exposure to that particular euphemism or whatever to say, oh, I know what that means, right?
Yeah.
And a kind of more recent example in my life, when I went from primary school to secondary school and into mathematics, the geometry teacher that I was assigned to support, brilliant young man, but from the standpoint of the culture and climate of the classroom, the ecology of the classroom that he had created,
Mm.
it was essentially like his living room in terms of familiarity with children. Like he was the uncle, the dad figure or whatever. Um, and there are elements of Mexican culture I just did not understand. And
Yeah.
and so I'm watching this biting sarcasm and I'm thinking like he hates the children. Like, how can you speak to them that way? And my own sensibilities and my own culture are kind of being offended and stuff, but I didn't react. And then it went on for a while, and I'm thinking, wow, this guy's kind of a jerk. I can't believe he's talking to kids that way. And so finally I asked him, like before class in private, as children were coming in, like, we were barely getting to know each other, but I noticed this thing, and I know from my standpoint and culture and stuff, it's kind of like borderline offensive. Like I don't understand
Mm.
it. And maybe I don't mean to be offended or to offend you by asking, but can you explain it? And then kind of carrying on in the same fashion, he asked the students my question. And says he, Dr. H is wondering about the interaction between us and this classroom. And so can I ask the students a question? He says, if you go to a party and your uncle is making fun of you and picking on you and being sarcastic, does that bother you? And they say, 2-1, no, not at all. And then he says, if your auntie is ignoring you, is, being semi-polite to you, what do you think? And they all kind of chimed up of like, oh, she's got a problem. She doesn't like me. She's mad at me or whatever. So it's kind of the inverse of what I was used to. Right. And so then that's that bridge that I needed to interpret the conversations and so on. And that's what I'm talking about in that figurative language. I did not have that translation piece to make it
Hmm.
work. So hold your horses. I'm like, where's the horses? I don't see horses. What horses? What am I supposed to hold? Right? That's missing. Right. And
Yeah.
and and so I dive into that figurative language part of it. But
Yeah.
getting back to the DSM, they have all of these field notes. They have
Yeah.
all of these descriptions of actual people that they've observed from these behavioral standpoints. And so we can tell the naysayers that yes, this behavior exists. We acknowledge that,
Hmm.
right? And this behavior is what classifies us in, the spectrum of autism. It describes outwardly what happens, the things that I say, my mannerisms, my delay, these it describes this output, but it does not describe the cognition that produces it.
Yeah.
And that's what we're talking about, this
Yeah.
gestalt processing.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
describing the cognition that produces it. So you
Yeah.
need not be a naysayer about things that you don't know about and that you don't talk about and that you don't study. And then those pieces I talked about, the psycholinguistic stuff, I point the naysayers to the psycholinguistics to say they've been describing what we're describing. They just haven't
Mm.
called it that, right? And so all of these things kind of gather a constellation of pieces and tangents and whatnot, to lay the groundwork for starting writing the book.
Yeah. And I think it's such a fundamental, going back to the original where we started about the DSM and repetitive speech and how you being used out of context. But really, that is exactly where, as a speech and language therapist, I start with parents. Like, I can hear your child saying this, or I can hear this like beautiful melody in their voice. I don't understand the words. I wonder what it, can you recognize that melody? Do you know where that's from? And it's being the detective. It's not just assigning, oh, they've got repetitive speech, or they've got or they're using jargon. That would have been a word that we perhaps might have used in the past. Actually, they are using intoned speech patterns, and I want to find out from the parent. You're a better detective than me because you know your child better than anybody else. Where do you think this might come from? Do you recognize that melody? Do you recognize the syllable structure, even if it's not clear, the speech itself? And that's when we start getting those sparks. And when we get it right, oh my goodness. I had this amazing example this week when I was visiting a school, and there was a little boy in the playhouse, and he said really, really clearly, as his teacher walked past, and she hadn't seen him in the house, and he said, "What's going on in here then?" As clear as anything.
Right.
And that was his way of grabbing her attention. He wanted her to know that he was in the house. He'd heard her say it to him, and it was almost, she said, it was like hearing the teacher voice. You could hear it, just his whole pattern, his inflection. It was just beautiful. And it was just that captured language. And that's how he speaks. He has lots of phrases and gestalts at the moment.
Aye. And that kind of carries into other things too.
Mm,
Uh, Conversations professionally, the stuff that we've been saying on the cognitive side, on the processing side, on
mm,
the ecological side of where this behavior is generated from.
mhm,
And a kind of a conversation, I'm a curious figure on campus where I work, and because of the way I talk and the words that I use, but it would be very similar to kind of a interaction I have with a particular teacher where, my words and American words don't match, right? And so I had a load of books come in from my classroom, and that particular teacher's there in the main office, and I'm telling the clerk, let me go get my trolley and I'll be right back. And the teacher looks at me and he's like, trolley? And he thinks train, right? I'm like, no, trolley is a cart, right?
mm.
Or, a pram versus, a stroller in
Stroller.
America. Or,
Yeah,
boots and bonnets versus trunks and,
yeah.
hoods and stuff like that. And so if you're looking through a document expecting to find um, a cart and you think trolley, then of course you're not going to find it, right? Because you're looking for the wrong thing. You don't understand the culture that wrote it and everything. But if you understand kind of the coding of it, when they say this, they mean that, right?
Mhm.
And so that was this morning's piece. That was here's criterion A, criterion B, and they're describing this thing. But what they mean is, and here's how we can tie it into the actual processing that produces this behavior, right?
Mm,
And we don't have to beat it up because it's kind of self-explanatory. We already have a definition for echolalia that
yeah.
that the industry and the science and they understand this. And so when criterion B talks about, repetitive patterns of behavior, that's echolalia, right? If we accept their premise that speech behavior in echolalia, repetitive, is a pattern of behavior, right? And so there it is in plain sight. We just have to read it as such. Same thing with criterion A and that, pragmatic communication and that social communication. When I have that classroom experience of not understanding, my speech was delayed. I did not engage. I was kind of shocked. And so you can look at that diagnostically and say, oh, that's Jamie again, being, a gestalt processor and being autistic and, delayed behavior and stuff. Well, absolutely, and here's why. Here's what's happening cognitively as I'm trying to figure this out. Am I in the wrong? Is he in the wrong? Are we not understanding each other? Are we not speaking the same language? And not just from the standpoint of me, writing in the King's English and them writing in simplified American English or whatever, but are we not um, are we not engaged on the same path? And so this current series is all about kind of translation. They say this, right? And that's my common kind of classroom device. It says I say and so. So the DSM says this, I say that, and so we're both talking the same language. We're just using slightly different words, right? I'm bringing a trolley and you're expecting a cart.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I guess that kind of leads us at quite a good point. If it's okay, we'll stop there today because it kind of leads into, I think, next week's conversation around gestalt cognitive processing. I feel that that is where we're evolving and maybe moving on to.
Well, yes, and kind of as a promotion for what's to come. Yes. So
Sorry,
when the
I already
series,
know.
yes, when the series does finish, it's kind of a very me version of this, but I write the end piece of this internal architecture and I say, okay, now I'm ready to write the field guide. But of course I'm not. Right. And so two more series come in, one of which I've written and the other one I have notes for to begin. But this concept of kind of I call the series reading between worlds.
Mm,
But from that standpoint, it's kind of a translation. And I began with kind of a very cheeky exercise that a lot of professional spaces, they put a meme up on the screen and there's, Ninja Turtles or silly mushrooms or whatever. And which mushroom are you feeling like today? Right. And we go down that rabbit hole. Um, but in terms of all of that stuff, um, I wanted to I wanted to kind of explain from the inside how that feels, right? So you talk
mm,
about cognition that produces it. When a Gestalt processor, adult or child, encounters these things, what
mm,
happens? How does
yeah,
that feel? What meanings do we make from it? And so this is where I'm kind of leaning into power threat, meaning framework, right? Power is giving me this. I'm making meaning from it. What threats are there professionally if I don't engage? Then my delay is interpreted a certain way, right? And even though they are aware I am autistic, I'm a gestalt processor, it doesn't matter. They still want that instantaneous response. Well, obviously I am Michelangelo, right? And this is why, they want
mm,
that very instant kind of analytic feedback. And so we go into the, analytic nature of systems and how whole to part doesn't really fit. Um, and so, what ends up happening as we get to the end of that series is someone like me, professional, high demand, high stress, or whatever, we burn out,
yeah,
we rupture. But that burnout and that rupture has been written about by everybody imaginable in the autism space. But I take of course, I take a slightly different angle to it, and that the rupture itself is data, right? The why behind it is data. And
mm,
then from that standpoint, do we return to the scene of the crime? And if we do, how do we do it in full knowledge of self? And how do we do it safely, right? And so the final pieces talk about the meaning map that our brains, our gestalt processing brains create in response to this, this power and this threat and the meanings that we make from it. By the time you're my age, as a Gestalt processor, you've made meaning maps. You know what to stay away from. You know how to engage, how not to engage. That too is data, right? And so if we're only focusing Gestalt processing stuff on children, then we don't have
mm,
fully developed meaning maps. And so part of the goal of the field guide is not from like a self-help, self-therapy kind of thing, walk you through 5 steps and you can create your own meaning map, for 39.95. Because the book won't be structured that way. But it is you can create this data in a community, we can share this data, and then we can use it to build from, right? And so you have parent groups in the UK, we have parent groups in America. We can get together and collaborate on where we see similarities, where we, like Venn diagrams and stuff,
Mm,
that we can be useful with this data, right? So it doesn't just stay at the speech den. It doesn't just stay at my school. But across the entirety of this space, we can gather all of this data that the naysayers say they want, right? So as if Marge's, longitudinal study never existed or whatever, but we can create this very kind of shallow initially longitudinal study across a lot of different bodies if we do it this way. And so that's where this is heading here, where we grow up, and I keep saying this in different spaces, but we have to imagine that the children that we work with will be fully mature adults, right? And
yeah,
that they, as adults, myself, my age, I'm still a gestalt processor. I'm still autistic. Um, the amount of stuff I do on screen and everything, it takes me a while to get there, and it takes me a while to
mhm,
get from there. That it might not take, somebody who's more polished and so on. And so the journey for me to be able to have this conversation with you, it took 55 years, right? And it took the right host to bring
mm,
that out, bring that safety and that relational field that I could feel comfortable doing it. And even in the first ones, I was a nervous wreck, right? And we expect that level, like this kind of conversational level that I can do now after 5+
mm,
decades of children. And when we
yeah.
don't see it, we think, oh my gosh, we have to take them to clinic and we have to do this and we have to do that. And,
We have to fix
the
them.
child just wants to watch a YouTube video and have fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jamie, I think that is a definitely a good time to stop today. We've had some lots of very interesting ideas, and I feel like it will just I don't know, it's so organic and lovely. It'll just continue next week and the week after.
Aye, but yes, and in terms of my writing schedule for the book and so on, I think current
Mm.
events with spring break and a coming labor strike and stuff have conspired to give me plenty of time at home to start putting a draft together. So,
Very exciting. I cannot wait for this next book. So
aye,
that's very exciting. So for now, I will say goodbye. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I'll
all
see
right.
you next week.
Yes, bye, and see you next week.